Hey guys, welcome back to 247 DIY. Have you ever snapped off a lug nut on your wheel stud, or even two? Well, stick around because I'm going to show you how to go ahead and replace them. Alright guys, so we're back working again here on the 2012 Forester. Last time I changed the wheels, I don't really know why it happened. It's never happened to me before. But I snapped off a stud with the lug nut here on the front driver's side wheel, as well as the rear driver's side wheel. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start on the driver's side here on the front. So let's get this in the air, we'll get our wheel off, and we'll go from there. Alright, so in order to replace this broken stud here, we need to get behind the rotor. In order to get the rotor off, we have to take our caliper off. So in order to get the caliper off, I'm going to remove this all in one piece instead of taking the slider portion off first and then the bracket. Keep in mind, if your brakes are old and worn, there may be quite a lip worn down here, which makes this process difficult without removing it in two pieces. If you're finding it, you're having trouble getting the caliper to slide off of the rotor, you may have to undo the slider portion of the caliper first, get that off, and then take your bracket off. The bracket is held on with two 17mm bolts. You're probably going to need some sort of breaker bar or an impact if they haven't been off before. I just recently did a brake job on these, so a couple of wrenches should be fine for me. And before we get too far, getting this caliper off in a minute, once it's off, we're going to have to hang it up out of the way. But to give us a little bit more room, there's a 12mm nut here that supports your brake line in place. We're going to pop that off so we can pull it out of the strut housing here and get this caliper hung up out of the way. And we'll just use a breaker bar here to slide the caliper off of the rotor. And then I just take a piece of, this was just a coat hanger that I cut up years ago for this specific purpose. You just bend it into an S shape like this, and then you can reach up on your coil spring from your strut and just hang your caliper up out of the way. You don't want that caliper to hang by the soft brake hose because it can damage the inner structure of the brake hose and cause braking problems in the future. Now, like I said, I just had these brakes off and replaced very recently, so my rotor is going to come right off of there. So if your rotor doesn't come right off, and they're usually going to be stuck on there pretty good, you can hit it with a hammer. That's probably the most tried and true method that most people go to, focusing your energy around here, and that will hopefully release it from the hub and you can get it off. But for Subarus, also keep in mind there are two threaded holes here. These are M8 by 1.25. If you get a couple of scrap bolts, you can thread them in there as long as they're not too rusted and the threads are still there. And then hit them with an impact lightly. That will push against the hub and pop your rotor right off, nice and easy. So now to move forward with getting this broken stud out. So this is a manual. I already have it in neutral, but if you have an automatic transmission, in order to get this to spin so that you can get this stud pointed in the right direction, you need to get it in neutral. I recommend doing that once the vehicle's already up in the air and your wheels are chalked. It's been years since I've driven an automatic, but if I remember right, you're going to need to put the key in the on position as well as depress your brake before you can release that gear shift and just pop it into neutral. Be very careful not to go into gear. Because the engine's running, it shouldn't cause a problem, but just be very careful of what you're doing. Get that transmission in neutral, and then you should be able to rotate your hub here to get the broken stud facing this kind of empty portion right here. Alright, so what we're going to do in order to get this stud out is we're simply going to hit it with a hammer and pop it out of the back side of the hub here. This is far enough back where there won't be any interference, but you do have this little lip of the heat shield here that we need to bend out of the way. As you can see, I live in a very rusty area that was extremely rusted. If you're so inclined, when you're all done, you can bend this back. I'm going to leave it. It's not going to hurt anything at all being bent over like that. It's just a little bit of excess material when it gets bolted between the knuckle and the hub. So now all we're going to do is give this a few firm whacks with a sledgehammer, and it'll hopefully pop right out of the other side of the hub. And there you go, comes out just like that. All right, so let's go over a couple things before we put this stud back in. This is a replacement stud I got. I was gonna go with OEM studs. However, it was gonna take quite a while shipping wise to get here. And I wanted to get these fixed quick. So these were from Rock Auto. I happen to have a Rock Auto distributor that's like a one-day shipping day away from me. So I ordered these up. Just go with a reputable brand when you buy studs. Don't grab them on eBay. Don't go with some brand you've never heard of, because quality of steel is a real issue on aftermarket parts. Just go with a reputable brand. I think this was a Beck Arnley, if I remember. I can't remember off the top of my head, but again, just go with a reputable brand. Now, even the closed-end Subaru lug nuts should be fine for what we're going to do next, but generally it's good to have a spacer. And what this is going to do is we're going to pull our stud through there, but it is a press fit that holds your studs in there. So we're just going to use this as a spacer, and then we're going to throw our lug nut on there and hit it with an impact. And I'll show you that in a minute, but I just wanted to explain this. Now, if you snap your lug nut off like we did, obviously you have to buy new lug nuts anyway. I have a whole set of lug nuts that I can grab lug nuts from, because I've got several different sets of wheels for this car. Buy yourself a couple extra ones, because I don't recommend using the one that we're going to hit with the impact and drive in, because when it drives against this nut, it's going to put a little groove in your lug nut. It would never be the end of the world, I don't think, but it's always good for your lug nuts to have a nice smooth mounting surface when they meet the wheel. This one's undoubtedly going to get a little marked up, a little bit damaged, so it's good just to have one that you can toss away when you're all done with the project. And real simply, we're just going to take the stud, pop it in there, put our spacer over, which, if I didn't explain, is just a big nut that I had laying around. Get your spacer on there, get your spare lug nut, get that on there, and then just take your impact and just drive it in until it meets the mounting surface of the hub here. And there you go. There's one replaced in the front. Super easy. If you have some tools and a space to work, absolutely something that you can do yourself. No need to spend extra money at a shop. So let's get this front end back together, and then we'll go ahead and move to the rear. And we're just going to follow the same steps in the rear to get this caliper off. Also keeping in mind that the two mounting bolts for the caliper in the rear are a 14mm bolt, unlike the 17mm bolt in the front. Now in the rear, there's really not a good area on the coil spring here to hang the caliper where it's out of the way. So I just turn it around like this, and I just set it up here on the upper control arm in such a way where it's not going to fall and damage this brake hose. Now you'll notice on this rear rotor, you have this very large portion. That's because Subaru, as well as a lot of other model vehicles, the emergency brake or the parking brake is a brake shoe setup. So effectively what you have is a rotor that also acts as a drum for your parking brake shoes, which are on the inside here. You'll notice a little rubber grommet right here. We're just going to pop that grommet out. And then we need to orient this so that it's down at the bottom. Again, putting your vehicle in neutral the same way you did for the front. Oh, and make sure your parking brake's off. Now once you have that oriented to the bottom, we're going to use a medium-sized flathead screwdriver. There's a little gear inside here, and we're going to turn that to release the brake shoes inward so that we can slide this entire rotor assembly off. It's really tough to get light in there to show you what I'm doing this way. So I'm going to get this off, and then I'll give you a close-up, and I'll show you what you should be looking for and how to adjust it. All right, right off the bat, you may notice that your kind of assembly here looks a bit different than mine. Like I said earlier, I live in a Rust Belt area. There's normally a large dust shield here. It's actually completely rusted away and fallen off somewhere on the highway, so don't be afraid if it looks a little bit different. If you have a big dust shield there, that's normal. So this was the gear on the bottom that I was talking about. So when you look through that hole, you're just going to get your screwdriver on there and pry against the hole itself for leverage. And in this case, I went up. Typically, it's going to be up to relieve pressure on these, and that should clear the lip that would form on the inside of the drum, and then you can slide that drum rotor assembly right off. And then when you go ahead and take a look at the assembly for the shoes here, you'll notice you've got a nice wide spot right over here, and so that's where we're going to want to line up our broken stud with, so we have room to pound it through out the backside. And there's that, just like the front, nice and easy. And just like the other side, we've got our new stud here. The nut we're using as a spacer, and our spare lug nut. And there's that, guys. Really not too involved. Pretty easy. Like I said, if you have the tools and space to work, this is definitely a job that you can do yourself. The only problem or only headache that you might get is if you live in a rusty area like I do. Sometimes these parts and these bolts can get a little stubborn, but where there's a will, there's a way, and if you want to do it yourself, you absolutely can. Alright guys, so that's it for the rear end. To put this back together, we're going to take our rotor, we're going to put it back on, we're going to line that window down here at the bottom again, and all we're going to do opposite of the way we took it off this time is we're going to move that gear in a downward direction. That's going to move your shoes out, and what you're going to do is every 2 or 3 turns of that gear, check your hub assembly here in your rotor. Once you get to the point where you can no longer move it by hand, because essentially your parking brake set, these pads will be pushing against the outer rim of the drum, then go ahead and move your gear up probably about 2, maybe 3 turns until you just get enough movement where the wheel can move freely. The idea is not to leave a huge gap between the pad and the drum, because then when you pull your e-brake, you're going to have a ton of movement there. And you don't want that. You want a nice firm e-brake. So what we're trying to do is get as little bit of a gap between the pad and the drum as possible, but also not touching, because you don't want your pads to just be dragging all the time, obviously. Alright guys, so that's it. Hope you found this video helpful. As you can see, replacing the wheel studs on your Subaru is not a nightmare. Keeping in mind that the older you get on your model Subaru, you may run into some complications where you can't actually pound those studs through. There's just not enough room for it. So like I said, this is a 2012. If yours is older than that, go ahead and just take a peek at the room you have behind your stud, just to make sure that you have enough room to pound that out before you go ahead and get started on this. Worst case scenario, you may have to remove the hub. In recent years, Subaru has moved to a bolt-in hub cartridge, which makes life a lot easier. Again, the older you start getting in the Subaru models, you start getting into pressed-in bearings, which can be a little bit of a nightmare. So just take a peek, see what you're dealing with. It may be something that, if that's the case, you may want to take it to a professional. But if you have a newer Subaru like this, 2012, very easy. Don't have to take it to a shop. You can save yourself a little bit of money doing it yourself. So as always guys, I really appreciate you watching the video. Go ahead and give it a like, and even leave a comment if you want, and please hit that subscribe button. Thanks.